Well, let me reiterate on behalf of Judy and myself, pleasure to be with you this evening and the next few evenings. Some of you don't know me from Adam. In fact, some of you probably know Adam better than you know me. So you've met Judy. We've been married 44 years this year. We have 2 children, both married, and between them they have 5 little girls. So we are privileged to have 5 granddaughters. 7 down to 2. Lovely little children, and we're very grateful to our children for having them. Although we love our children as well and their spouses. Let me just introduce you to some of the resources that I've brought with me. I'm not a very good salesman, but I do believe in what I've written. That's why I've written them. Basically, I've brought some books, and the books are pretty much dedicated to Jesus and the Father and the Spirit. There are some other topics that are dealt with as well, but my focus is on encountering God in his magnificence. And I just brought one with me, which was the first book that I wrote, which is called God and Us. My wife Judy had said, we don't get enough sermons on God. And with my theological college hat on, I thought, well, most of the books that I have and most of the books in our college library are this thick. They're heavy in content, and they're a bit complex, and they're not always helpful in terms of engaging with the remarkable God who wants us to encounter him. So I thought, well, I will write a book, and I did. And it's a gentle journey into who God is. And while we were sitting there, Judy reminded me that she had a conversation with a lady who had bought this, who was she was middle-aged, and she said, I've been reading this book and thoroughly valuing it, but I haven't been able to read it for a while because my 16-year-old granddaughter has taken it and she's enjoying it as well. So whatever age, you might find that's of benefit to you. Take it and have a look. But the other important element of our ministry relates to something that is crucially important to Judy and myself. Just to give a context, for much of my life, I've been a theological college lecturer in Regent's Theological College, fundamentally a New Testament tutor. And 5 years ago, I had the opportunity to leave. Sounds as if I was leaving prison. I thoroughly enjoyed my time there. It was a great place to be. But I was given the opportunity to have a wider portfolio and focus on teaching here and abroad. And that's what I've been doing in these last 5 years, and also setting up training programs for leaders, especially in the majority world, but also in running a ministry called Word and Spirit, which is dedicated to helping people like you and me engage with the Bible in ways that are refreshing, enjoyable, and will make a difference to our lives. And so we have created DVDs and booklets that people have used in their personal devotions, in life groups, in church-based Bible schools, and in denominational training. If you think they could be of value to you, please take them and have a little look. But let me tell you what I'm going to talk about this evening and the next few evenings. I have a couple of aims. One of my aim is to address the question, why did the gospel writers include the healings of Jesus? I have no doubts that those healings occurred, and they are there for a purpose. My question is, why are they recorded? In order for us to understand the significance of these stories, as they are told by Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, we have to remind ourselves that they were not actually recorded for our benefit as 21st century people. They were recorded for first century people, and the gospel writers, although we sometimes think of them as biographers or historians, and they were both, but fundamentally they wrote as pastors to various congregations, and their congregations differed from one another, and the stories that they told were intended to make statements of value to their readers. That's why when some of the stories are told by more than one gospel writer, sometimes there's differences in the stories, not contradictions. They're not correcting one another, but they are emphasizing certain aspects of the same story for the benefit of their readers who are different to other readers in that first century context. So one of my aims in our time together is to help you recognize the value of putting yourself in a first century context when it comes to hearing these well-known stories again, and we will find that they will be more meaningful. And in doing that, in effect, sitting as a first century hearer to a first century writer, the more we do that, the more we will understand, that's why this story was included in the first place. And we're going to focus on one of those stories this evening, and we'll do the same in the next 3 evenings together. But I was interested in the songs that we were singing earlier, the first 2 in particular, which focused on the love of God. How do we know? Not that God loves us. We have plenty of evidence that God loves us, but do we have any insights into the characteristics of that love? God's a spirit. We don't see him. For that matter, we don't see Jesus either. How do we know the intimacy of that love, if indeed it is intimate? Well, of course, one of the reasons that we can respond positively to that question is by recognizing that when Jesus came to this earth, he didn't just come to save us. Of course he did, fundamentally important for us. But also, as fundamentally important to him, this was the opportunity for 33 years when God would be revealed as accurately as could be imagined through the person of Jesus. So when we see Jesus in this story this evening, we are not just being given the privilege of exploring Jesus, but we are being given the privilege of exploring God, who is invisible. So I'm hoping that not only will you be impressed with Jesus as a result of our time together, and I don't say that as some kind of religious jargon that we should be impressed with him. I truly hope that you will be even more impressed with Jesus as a result of exploring something about him in this story, but at the same time, you will become even more impressed with our God, who we sang loves us. But he loves us with an incredible, intimate love that is beyond our dreams, probably beyond our comprehension, but it's as if Jesus says, come and look at me, and you'll have a better understanding of the love of God for you. So we're going to explore a story, and I will get to the story in a moment, but I want to introduce the context to you first, because this is a story about a man. It's a man who lives his life in a corner, a metaphorical corner of silence. It's a lonely life that he lives. And it's a lonely life and an isolated life because he is deaf. So he can't hear. Sorry, that patronizes you, doesn't it? Telling you what deaf means. You obviously know that it means he can't hear. But on top of that, he has a problem with speaking. Some kind of speech impediment, maybe a stammer, we don't know because the biblical text isn't clear, but he has a problem with his speech. As a result of both of those challenges, his contribution to his community, his village, is very limited indeed. He finds it difficult to communicate. He finds it difficult to participate in the conversation because even if he can lip read somebody speaking to him, he can't enunciate a response because it's just too embarrassing for him to do that. It's a humiliation, so he keeps quiet and he comes back into his corner, his metaphorical corner of silence and loneliness and isolation. And then, of course, Jesus comes to his village. And you know what's going to happen because you've read about Jesus before. You know that Jesus is going to transform his situation, and sure enough, he does. At which point you were thinking, well, this is going to be an even shorter sermon than I was hoping for because he's already told me the end. And he's painted the picture as to why this story is being told. It is to teach me that Jesus is a healer. Well, that is certainly true. Jesus was a healer. Jesus still is a healer when it ties in with his will. But that is not the reason why this gospel writer tells us this story. At least, that is not his main priority. So why then does he, Mark, tell this particular story to his readers if it's more than that Jesus can heal? Well, let me tell you about his readers, and that will better help you. Mark is writing his gospel to a group of Christians who were living in the city of Rome. I know Mark's gospel is the second gospel in our list, but it was actually the first gospel to be written, and Peter, the apostle, gave young Mark the information, and together they put a message that would be valuable to their readers in Rome. The context of the Christian readers in Rome is this. Most of them in the first century, and we're talking about 30 years after Jesus has gone to heaven, most of the Christians in Rome are poor, uneducated. They live on the lower echelons of society. They do not have the opportunity to plan their futures. Many of them are coming from a slave context or one level above. There's not many rich Christians in first century Rome. Not many Christians who have the ability to meet in big groups. They don't have that kind of money, so they're dotted in house groups throughout the city. Their lives are marginalized. They were marginalized before they became Christians because of their poverty and their low social status in society, but that marginalization will increase because now they've become Christians. And the Jewish people who might know them dismiss them as following this traitor, this blasphemer, this pseudo-Messiah called Jesus. But the Romans who know them, and most of the Christians are not Jews in first century Rome, most of their colleagues and friends and employers dismiss them out of hand as being stupid to believe in this gospel of Jesus. How can you Christians believe that a God would want to come and live on this earth? None of our gods would ever want to do that. Why would your God want to come and live on this earth? And then he spends 33 years not in a palace but in poverty. And the people he comes to preach the good news to, what do? Well, they largely ignore him and finally reject him, and indeed they crucify him as a common criminal. And you believe that he is Messiah. You believe that he is God in the flesh. You are to be pitied because we understand that you think that he rose from the dead. Won't you people realize that you've got it wrong? So the Christians are further marginalized, not just because of their poverty and their limited education, but because they have decided to follow this new religion called Christianity. And the Roman society has already decided that Christians are to be pitied as people who don't have much common sense. But the marginalization is going to get worse because there's a new emperor. And if you know your Roman history, most of the emperors in the first century weren't particularly good people. They were amoral in lifestyle, and the emperor that I'm talking about here is Nero. Nero was a profligate, a tyrant, a despot before he became the emperor, and when he became the emperor, then he had the machinery to put that into operation to a greater degree. And one of his plans was to leave an everlasting memorial to himself, and what better than to create part of Rome in his own image. Part of the problem of that, of course, was that there was already Rome there. There was no space. And a fire started in Rome, and it lasted for days. And the fire took hold of the city, and because of the combustible materials in the city and because of the wind that fanned the flames, 2/5 of the city was ravaged. Hundreds, thousands of Roman citizens perished in the flames. They just couldn't run away fast enough. And very soon, people began to ask the question, who caused the fire? Who caused the fire? And very quickly, the finger of suspicion was pointed to Nero. Now, Nero was a tyrant, and he had all power available to him, but he knew the power of the mob. And because of that, he decided that he needed to deflect suspicion from himself to somebody else, and you can guess who he chose. He chose the Christians. And the Christians were charged with having caused the fire, which, as far as we can tell from our Roman historians, they laid the finger of suspicion at Nero himself. But at the time, when that finger was deflected to the Christians, nobody stood up for the Christians. Nobody defended the Christians, even though Tacitus, a Roman historian, made the point in his first century writings that nobody believed that the Christians caused the fire, but nobody defended them. And the Christians in Rome, who have only recently become followers of Jesus, learn new words as part of their vocabulary. They learn new experiences. They are scared. Scared because of the knock that is going to result in them being rushed off to prison where they will be tortured, crucified, and burned alive, so that the crowds will be able to go from the center of Rome to Nero's palace. They will be crucified either side of the esplanade, and they will be burned at night to be human torches. This was a time of fear, of panic, of loneliness, of living a life in a corner of isolation and uncertainty. Uncertainty because where's Jesus? You see, Jesus had said that he was coming back, but that was 30 years ago. Jesus, now would be a good time if you were to come back, because we need you. Now, they knew that Jesus had said that followers of his would be persecuted, but the fear that dogged their steps was, does he know what we're going through? Does he care? Does he have time for us? We're not Jews. We are Romans. We haven't been to Jerusalem. We haven't heard him preach. Does he have time for us? That's why this story is told, and that's why this gospel is told. This story is not particularly for 21st century people who know what we're doing for Christmas, who've already planned our next summer holidays. These people didn't know whether they were going to be around this time next week. And Mark and Peter have a message of hope that they want to present to their readers. And they tell it through the ministry and the life of Jesus. And remember, Jesus is the best picture that we have of God the Father. And so Mark has the opportunity to say to his readers, let me tell you about your Savior. Let me tell you about your God. And may that be a context into which you can put your sufferings to help make some sense of them. Because the Creator of the universe has time for you. So let's read the story. It's in Mark chapter 7, and it's from verse 31. If you think that was a long introduction, please be encouraged, because the rest of the sermon will not be as long as you might think. This is the only record of this story in the Gospels. Some of the stories in the Gospels are mentioned in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Feeding of the 5,000 is in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Very few of the stories are only told once. This is one of those stories that's only told once. And given that Mark is the first writer, Matthew and Luke have Mark's gospel available to them, so they have chosen not to include this story. It's not so relevant for their readers, but it is so pertinent for Mark's readers. And although you are not being persecuted, I suspect, although you might not be suffering to the degree of the Roman readers, there are times when life ambushes us, times when the pillars on which we base our lives are shaking. And we need the same message to come into the depths of our psyche, that the God of the universe has time for us. So here's our story. Then Jesus returned from the region of Tyre, and he went through Sidon to the Sea of Galilee in the region of the Decapolis. And they brought to him a man who was deaf, and he had a speech impediment, and they begged him to lay his hand on him. And taking him aside from the crowd privately, he put his fingers into his ears, and after spitting, he touched his tongue. And looking up to heaven, he sighed and said to him, Ephphatha, and that is, be opened. And his ears were opened, his tongue was released, and he spoke plainly. Mark, why did you tell that story? What is the significance of that story? And interestingly, Mark, why did you slow down the healing? You see, Mark doesn't have sermons in his gospel. Matthew has 5 sermons. John has healings with long discourses after them. But Mark is a busy gospel. Story after story after story. Don't think that this is a simplistic gospel, because Mark teaches through stories. The most common word in the Gospel of Mark is the word and, kai in Greek. He uses it 1,400 times. There's only 16 chapters. But you get an idea as to the way that Mark writes. It's as if he hasn't got time for full stops, let alone semicolons. He just has and. Jesus did this, and then he did that, and then he did this. He's a busy Jesus, meeting people's needs. Another important word in the Gospel of Mark is the word euthus. It means immediately. Mark uses it 40 times. Jesus is busy, immediately doing this, immediately doing that. Funnily enough, when stories in Mark are told in Matthew and Luke, sometimes they leave the word immediately out. It's as if it's a little bit tedious for them, I imagine. But Mark puts it in because for him, his readers need to know that Jesus is immediately interested in their situation. It's not just a throwaway word. It's keenly of value. But funnily enough, in this story, the healing is slowed down. Mark, are you coming to the end of the papyrus and you have some space? You have to slow down and put some extra words in? Are you struggling to think about what to say? No. These writers are wordsmiths. They're craftsmen. They don't just think of the first thing that's come into their mind and they write it. They write with a purpose, and this is no exception to that. So I want to come back to this story. We'll look at them verse at a time. I'll have it up on the screen if you don't mind. We'll take it from that verse 31, if you don't have your text with you, because I want to ask questions of the text. Please, when you're reading the Gospels, slow yourself down as Mark has done and ask questions of the authors. Don't expect an audible voice, but you are giving yourself the chance to ask a question, and in asking the question, you will be surprised as to what you might discover would be an appropriate response. Or you might even hear the Spirit nudging you in the direction of a response. That's what we're going to be doing. So I'm interested in verse 31 because Jesus has been on a journey, and Mark chooses to tell me that Jesus has been on a journey. And I say, Mark, I don't care where he's been, just get to the story, as you've done on previous occasions. Why do I need to know where Jesus has been? So let's just think about it. If you don't know the geography of Israel, I will be it. My head is the Sea of Galilee. It's quite round, my head and the Sea of Galilee. This will be the River Jordan, and my feet will be the Dead Sea. We aren't going to get there, but that's the kind of drift. Here is the land of Israel as we know it, where Jesus spent most of his ministry, and there's the coast onto the Mediterranean, the Greek Sea, as it was known in the first century. Way up here on the top, in what is now modern Lebanon, is Tyre and Sidon. Sea of Galilee, the towns around it, the villages, this is where Jews live, and almost exclusively Jewish people live here. Here, on this side of the River Jordan, is the area that we know as the Decapolis. That's what it's defined as there. The Decapolis, it's a Greek word. It means 10 cities. 10 cities in this relatively desert-like area, arid area, on the extremities of the Roman Empire, which kind of stops there. These cities band together in some military and economic community to provide some sense of togetherness. What is Mark telling me? This is what he's telling me. Jesus has been in Tyre and Sidon. He comes to the Sea of Galilee. He doesn't stop. He goes into the Decapolis. Who cares? Why do I need to know? Why does Mark's audience need to know? Here's why it's interesting. Tyre and Sidon were not Jewish towns. They were Gentile towns. Some Jews lived there, but they were fundamentally pagan towns. Jesus went there. Now, I thought Jesus had come to save the Jews. He chose 12 Jewish disciples. His message was to the Jewish community. But don't lose sight of the fact that Jesus doesn't have a bias to one people group. He has a bias to the world, including you and me. And here he's been to where the Gentiles are. He goes to Galilee, but he doesn't stop there. He's done that many times, and he will do so again. But he moves across to another area of Gentile territory, and he ministers to one man who's there. Roman readers, you were Gentiles. Maybe you were thinking this is why you were suffering, because you were not Jews. You don't have the prophets. You don't have the traditions of the Jewish people. Maybe this is why you were second class and you were suffering in a way that the Jews aren't suffering. Don't misunderstand Jesus. He has time for you, Roman readers, just like he has time for these pagans in Tyre and Sidon, just like he has time for this one Gentile man who lives in Gentile territory. I need to know that from time to time as a 21st century Christian, because sometimes I will believe my own perception of my unimportance to Jesus. And I am not unimportant to Jesus, and neither are you. And this story, if it teaches us nothing else, teaches us that God, in the person of Jesus, is more interested in us than we would dare imagine. And if I doubt it, then I need to remind myself about the truth of this story. Well, let's move into the next verse, because the people bring to Jesus this man, and you see what they ask him to do. They ask Jesus to touch him. Why do they ask Jesus to touch the man? Is there something magical about his touch? Well, maybe some of the people think that there is something magical about his touch. But what is it that I am supposed to learn about Jesus touching this man? You see, if we pray for people, we may well put our arm around their shoulders, that's my practice, or we may put our hand on their forehead, and it's often a sign of our compassion, our togetherness with that person. Is that why Jesus is encouraged to touch the man? Well, in the first century, touch wasn't so much a symbol of compassion. Of course, Jesus was compassionate. That's why he came in the first place. But when he touched people, it was a statement of his authority. And that's why the people are asking Jesus to touch this man, because they sense Jesus has authority. Let me just unpack this a little bit more, and I'll use Andrew as my example, since I know him a little bit and he won't be offended, and I'm worrying him now by saying that. But let's imagine that Andrew is a first century Jew, and he is ill. Whatever the illness, the assumption of everybody else here in his community, if you are Jews, is that Andrew has sinned. That's why he is ill. That was the perception of most of the people in the first century. And they had a hint in that direction from the Old Testament, where God sometimes chastised a Jewish person with illness because of a sin that had been committed. He didn't do it many times, but he did it sometimes. And the assumption in the first century is that if you were ill, that is the reason. It wasn't true, but that's what the people perceived. So that's why you don't get many Jewish doctors, because a doctor is going to undermine that which God has done. If God has chastised Andrew with an illness, then it is because Andrew needs to repent. And if I, as a doctor, offer him therapy, then I am undermining what God has done. So you don't get many Jewish doctors. Now, here's where it gets tricky. If I want to offer Andrew some comfort, some therapy, or just some compassion, the one thing I cannot do is touch him, because in touching him, I will be contaminated ceremonially with the uncleanness that is assumed to be part of his being because of the illness, the mark of God upon him. This is why Leviticus 13:14 says, do not touch the leper. Not because you're going to be contaminated by leprosy, but you'll be contaminated with the ceremonial uncleanness that is associated with leprosy. If you touch the leper, you will go through a process of 7 days of decontamination, and then you can enter society again. So what they're asking Jesus to do, in effect, is to break the law. Please touch this man. Now, for me to touch Andrew isn't a problem at all. I can do that. But the tricky thing is, if Jesus does it, is the assumption that you, Jesus, are going to be contaminated with the uncleanness that is associated with this man. And if this man is a leper, then that ceremonial uncleanness is going to be exacerbated considerably. So notice, just in passing, that when Jesus does heal lepers, and he heals lepers more than most illnesses, he often is defined as stretching to touch the leper. Not just touching them, but making a point of sort of deliberately, I've got to make a point. You see what's your name? Tom. So I'm deliberately touching Tom. I haven't accidentally rubbed up alongside of him and found out too late that he's a leper. No, I know he's a leper. And you are watching me do it. Now, let's see what happens to Tom. Good grief. He's been cleansed. But what's happened to you, Jesus? Nothing. Do you see my point? The touch of Jesus was indicative of his authority. And so they ask Jesus, Jesus, will you please touch him? On occasions, Jesus has done that. He doesn't do it all the time, but sometimes he does. And so I'm assuming that that's what Jesus is going to do this time, except he doesn't. At least there's no mention that he touches him. And I'm a little disappointed, especially if I have brought this man to Jesus in the hope that he will touch him and be restored. I believe that Jesus can do it, so that's why I'm bringing him. But you see what Jesus does? It's in the next verse. Taking him aside from the crowd privately. Again, I want to ask Jesus, why do you do that? Why do you do that? Why don't you just heal him? And then you can move on to the next person who has a need. Why are you slowing the process down and taking this man to one side and healing him privately? Well, at the moment, we don't know whether he is. He's just taken him away. Now, maybe it was because the crowd had some kind of unbelief that made it difficult for Jesus to function. Jesus never has any difficulty doing what Jesus wants to do. He's God. He can do what he likes. Nobody's going to stop Jesus doing what he wants to do. And anyway, there's no indication that there was unbelief in the community because they brought the man to Jesus for Jesus to touch him. So they are anticipating that there will be a miracle. So then, Jesus, why do you do it? You don't need peace and quiet, surely. Well, let's imagine that Jesus comes into our room this evening. And he walks to the front, and he turns around and he looks at you. By that time, I've stopped talking because I anticipate he's going to want to say something important and even tell the story better than me. But imagine if he walks back down through the audience and looks at you, and you're quite relaxed because you know it's Jesus, you know he's not scary. And in the process of walking, he just reaches and touches this man here. What's your name? Tony. Excuse me for picking you out, but you won't be disappointed, because if Jesus had stopped and asked Tony to come for a little stroll together, I think that the only one not disappointed in this audience would be Tony, because Jesus has picked Tony. He's missed these important people on the front row and the music group, and he's picked on Tony. And if I was Tony, I would take my time to get up rather slowly just to let people know that he's picked me. He's picked me. And that's what Jesus does to this man. Now remember, this man has a very limited place in his society. He is almost invisible because he has so little that he can contribute. And Jesus, who, remember, is the creator of the universe, he is the one who says, Tony, come on, I would like to have a little stroll. Just you and me together. No mention about healing. Just want to be with you. And the message is, I've got time for you. Just to remind ourselves that although we're in chapter 7 of Mark, and he's got 16 chapters, nearly a half of the Gospel of Mark is the last week of Jesus' life. So Jesus is already turning to face Jerusalem. He's beginning to fear that which is going to happen when he will experience emotions and challenges that he has never experienced before. You would forgive him if he would want to get there quickly. But he's got time for this man, this Gentile, this invisible man, this lonely man, this helpless man, this man who is insignificant. He's got time. And what does he do next? Well, he puts his fingers in his ears. Is that what we're supposed to do if we're praying for somebody who's ill? Do we always have to touch where they're ill? I hope not. Jesus, why'd you do it? You've never done it before. You don't do it again. Why'd you put your fingers in your ears? To be honest, the Greek isn't clear. Does he put his own fingers in his own ears, or his own fingers in the man's ears, or the man's fingers in his ears? We're not quite too sure what it is, but somebody's fingers get put in somebody's ears. And I suspect that Jesus is either doing this or he's doing that. Now, why? Why, Jesus? Jesus, for goodness sake, just heal him, and then you can get on. But that's not the reason why Jesus does the healing. And that's not the reason why Mark includes the story, because this is not a story about healing. Of course, Jesus does heal him. I have no doubts about that. But this is a story about Jesus who has time for the ordinary. God the Father, in the person of Jesus, has time for the ordinary. And this man who has a terrible speech impediment is not going to have to respond to Jesus' question, so what do you want me to pray for? I know your problem. This is your problem. Just symbolizes his problem by touching his ears. It's not just a statement of compassion, but it is a powerful statement of compassion. Compassion that is articulated in a gentle, personal, individual way. But I'm going to have to get to it. Jesus spits. And you can almost imagine this is why Matthew and Luke didn't want to put the story in, because this notion of Jesus spitting. But of course, we've got to remember what that means in a first century audience. Because spittle was viewed in a first century audience as having therapeutic powers, therapeutic properties. I come from South Wales, lived in the countryside. If I was out playing with my friends, I would graze my knee or cut myself or have an abrasion, and I would come home and my mother would be there. She was a Christian. I never thought of it as a miracle worker, but she did have spittle, and the spittle on my cut, and I'd be off playing again. In our worldview, spittle had therapeutic properties, and in the first century, ancient Near Eastern world, spittle was associated with therapy. And in fact, for those of you who are ministers or vicars here present, the spittle of a rabbi, so that's kind of like a first century equivalent of a minister or a pastor or a reverend or a vicar or a curate or wherever you are, or an elder, the spittle of a first century rabbi had double therapeutic power. That was the belief. And if that rabbi had fasted for 40 days, then the spittle had double that potency. So when Jesus uses spittle, he is again very gently leading this man to his healing in a way that is meaningful to the man. Does he need to do it? Of course he doesn't. Should I have to do it when I pray for people before I put hands on them? Absolutely not. It is completely inappropriate. But what Jesus does fits that man's situation. And here's how it works. Jesus takes spittle from his perfectly working tongue, and he touches the man's imperfectly working tongue. I wouldn't do it to you. I wouldn't expect you to allow me to do it to you. But the man recognizes the message that Jesus is presenting without Jesus speaking, as a result of which he wouldn't be able to hear. I know something good is going to happen to me. Something positive, something therapeutic is going to happen to me. There's no healing yet. The healing is yet to come. But in a sense, that's considerably less important than the message I'm hearing about Jesus. I want to lead you from where you are to where you will be, which in your case is healing, but I want to do it in such a way that you realize that I am completely in charge of your journey. I know your situation. I know where you are. I know where you are going to be, and I'm going to comprehensively care for you throughout that process. And you Roman readers who are listening to this story being read to you, you need to know that that's how Jesus functions in your life. Because he knows where you are, and he knows where you are going to be, which for some of you will be martyrdom, not restoration. The suffering will not be removed, but you will not be going there on your own, because his comprehensive care will be as present in your life as it was in the life of this nobody, this invisible person who lived in this little Gentile village. And so the story goes on and comes to a conclusion. Jesus looks up to heaven as if to say, that's where my power is coming from. It's okay, I'm not a wizard. I'm not some magician. I'm not some occultic person. Relax. I know this is where my power comes from. And he sighs as well, as if to let the person know, I'm feeling for you. My heart is with you. I can't say that in words because you can't hear me, but I want you to see that I have time. And then his word, epaphtha, which is funnily enough a difficult word to say without spitting, but it is an Aramaic word, which is the language of the first century person. The first word he hears is in his mother tongue. It's not the word that we use when we pray for people. It's not some kind of magic special word. Be opened. And the healing occurs. But do not lose sight of the fact that this is not a story just about Jesus the healer. In fact, the more important lesson, much more important, is that Jesus is someone who has time for us. And on this occasion, it meant that the man was healed. But in our lives, we will need him in other respects, and he will have that same determination to demonstrate his care for us in the time that he invests in our lives. Me? Surely not. He's looking after the universe. He's got very many more important people to deal with. Well, if this story is true, and if this story is told for a reason, it is to say, but Keith, you are included because you are just like that man in the corner. But just one last thing. I mentioned that the man had a speech impediment. And the Greek word that is used there is mogelalon. And you say, who cares? And generally I would say, I agree, who cares? But Mark is a craftsman. And he uses this word specifically. The man is not dumb, he has a speech impediment. And this word mogelalon is not used anywhere else in the New Testament other than here. And it's nowhere else used in the Greek of the Old Testament. The Hebrew of the Old Testament was translated into Greek because by the first century, very few people could speak Hebrew, so they had to put it into Greek. So in the Greek Old Testament, which is used by the Jews of the day and by many of the Christian Jews of the day, that word mogelalon is used just once. And it's in the prophet Isaiah. And Isaiah gives a prophecy in chapter 35, and he says, God is coming. And when God comes, he will do at least two things. He will unstop the ears of the deaf, and he will make the stammering speech released. Mogilalon. Mark, you are quoting the Old Testament, or at least alluding to it. But Mark, that was a prophecy about something that God would do. Here, it's Jesus doing it. You can't be telling me that Jesus is God, can you, Mark? Because it looks as if you're saying that Jesus is validly fulfilling a prophecy that God was supposed to fulfill. Mark, of course, and you and I would say, but that's right, Jesus is God. He is not inferior to God the Father. He is equivalent in deity, in godness, as God the Father and God the Spirit. And when Jesus functions, he functions as God. This is not just Jesus giving his time to this man. This is God, through Jesus, giving his time. The creator of the universe is the one who has come to this little village, to this one man who lives in this metaphorical corner of silence and loneliness, and says, hang on a little bit, because something good is going to happen to you. You're going to get your ears and your tongue back. But before that, you need to know something much more important. I have time for you. Now, as I say it, I feel a strange emotion within me, because it sounds precocious, preposterous, shocking, that God has time for us, for me, not just for us as a community, but for me, for you when you are on your own and the community is no longer part of your experience, that God has time for us. Well, this is the story. This is the message. This is the truth. I'm going to pray, and then we're going to sing a song which is well known to all of you, How Great Thou Art. And when you sing it, remember that we are not just making doctrinal statements about God, speaking about him objectively as the great God, which of course he is. But he is the great God who, in the context of his greatness, has dedicated himself to us, to you and me. Not even because we are particularly good Christians, but because we are sons and daughters of his. That didn't deserve to be sons and daughters, but he chose us to be part of his family. But before we sing it, come and join me, ladies and gentlemen. And we're going to sing the song as soon as I've prayed. Father, one of the first things that I said or considered was, how can we truly know some of the characteristics of your love? Because we don't just want to think of you loving us in a general way, although that would be far more than we deserve, but to be able to probe your love and to recognize certain characteristics that make us stand back in awe. That would be wonderful. So thank you for this story. Thank you, Jesus, for engaging in this healing in this way. Thank you for ensuring that the story is told and recorded and retained through the millennia, because now we have solid evidence that you don't just love us from a distance, but you love us imminently and personally and individually. Thank you so much. And as we sing this song, well, we truly believe the words are true. You are resplendent and grand. And that's the wonder that you have chosen to bring us into your compass despite your grandeur. Thank you so much. Amen.